Now. Uh, Good evening, everybody. It's Steve Simpson, and this is Midwest Critical Care Collaborative Meeting for the 12th of February, 2015. We have several things to talk about that I'm sort of excited about showing you. Well, some I'm excited about, some are a little bit difficult to talk about. Um, but we'll start in, I guess. Bob, I don't think that it's going to take long for me to do some of these first things, so I will go ahead and start in with these. So you can see I've titled this Changing Definitions, Current State, and Open Meta-Analysis. So I've got two or three things to show you, some of which are data that you guys participated in generating, but we will just start right off from the top. So just under a year ago, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, there was a consensus conference about sepsis terminology that met in Brussels. It was a consensus conference of a number of people who are deemed experts in sepsis, including Mitchell Levy, who is one of the founders of the Surviving Sepsis campaign, including people like Jean-Louis Vincent, who is a big name in the sepsis world if you work in critical care, including numerous people from Society of Critical Care Medicine, European Society of Intensive Care Medicine, and et cetera. And so they sat down in the room and they talked over, okay, our current terminology and how we describe sepsis. Is it adequate? Is it inadequate? Is it not? Is it good enough or not? And this, of course, what I've got here on the screen is how we currently define severe sepsis, or how we define our categories of sepsis, so that we say an infection is an infection, and it is what it is. But if it gives you systemic manifestations, meaning if it gives you SIRS, 2 out of the 4 SIRS criteria, then we call it sepsis. If it gives you organ dysfunction, then we call it severe sepsis. And then, of course, if it gives you hypotension that does not resolve with volume administration, then we call it septic shock. You guys are all very familiar with this. This is what you have all learned and used to your advantage in your hospitals. And so the guy said, is this serving us well? And so after some discussion, they decided that they are going to recommend that we make some changes in our sepsis terminology. And here's what they are going to recommend that we have. What they're going to recommend is that we use the terms infection, sepsis, and septic shock, and that we are going to drop the term severe sepsis from our lexicon. Now, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And what's their rationale? I will show you on the next slide. But basically, how this is going to fall in is like this. They're going to say if you have an infection, or if you have an infection with SIRS, we're just going to refer to that as infection. Meaning, if you have a pneumonia with SIRS, it'll just be called pneumonia. If you develop organ dysfunction, we are going to call that sepsis. And so basically what we currently call severe sepsis is going to be called sepsis. And what we currently call septic shock, meaning hypotension that fails to respond to volume administration, we're going to continue to call that septic shock. Is that clear enough so far? Anybody speak up if there's anything? I think that's fairly straightforward what we're doing. The question is going to be, why are we doing it? And I'm sure that's going to be your next question, and so that's why it's the next thing that I put here on the chart. And I'll be straight with you. I am not certain that I agree with the logic myself as a person in the trenches here. Um, and I also want to say, backing up to this, I also want to say this was a consensus conference of people in Brussels. They are now seeking sign off for this from multiple societies, including the American Thoracic Society, the American College of Chest Physicians. I think they have essentially sign off by Society of Critical Care Medicine because they were one of the organizers of the conference. At any rate, they're going around seeking sign off on these definitions by people from various important societies so that we truly have consensus and not just a conference opinion. So there are two or three things that go into the rationale here. Um, One thing that I forgot to get on this list is this. You have to remember that the definitions we've been dealing with for the last 20 years are also the definitions from a consensus conference, meaning there was a conference in 2001 chaired by Roger Bone, with a number of other people in it from multiple medical societies that hammered out the definitions that we've been using for the past 22, 23 years. And it was based on consensus in one sense. And that sense is that they all got together and agreed, okay, this should be what our definition should be going forward. In another sense, it was data driven. And so I hear some of these guys saying, and this is what I want to pick up, some of these guys at the consensus conference go, well, it was just consensus. It wasn't driven by data. And I have to constantly remind them that, yes, indeed, it was driven by data, and that Roger Bone did take the time to find out in a large study what the consequences are of the various different categories that we have. In essence, having an infection, very low mortality, having sepsis increases mortality to between 5 and 9%. Having severe sepsis increased the mortality further. Having septic shock in his study was a 40 to 60% mortality. And so it was driven by data. And so I find that argument that they have told me to be a little bit spurious when they say, oh, it wasn't driven by data, it was just a consensus conference. That I don't agree with. But here's some of their other rationales for why they might want to change. So what they say is, after over 20 years of educational efforts, it's still an uphill battle. People still do not recognize our definitions of severe sepsis. And pardon me, I'm going to try and get it so my pointer just stays visible instead of, that's pen color, arrow. There we go. So they're saying people still don't know what sepsis is. And in fact, people just talk about, people don't understand severe sepsis. And then they're correct. In many, many new hospitals that I go to, the terminology severe sepsis is still brand new in 2015. Most doctors wind up calling what we would call severe sepsis, you and I, often gets called really bad pneumonia, or it's just referred to as sepsis. And very often the term sepsis doesn't get applied until a patient actually has what you and I would call septic shock, possibly with multiple organ dysfunction. So these are the reasons that they give, that basically we're fighting an uphill battle, or for a different metaphor, we're swimming upstream. The current's too strong. We're not making headway. People aren't recognizing severe sepsis. And so we should just sort of give in to that fact, recognize that they're not going to use the term severe sepsis, and change our terminology. As you can see here, I'm asking the question, are these good reasons? I'm not personally convinced. how could I be after spending the last 22 years teaching people about severe sepsis and trying to get people to understand what the terminology is and should be. Nevertheless, this is some wind that's blowing, and I wanted to give you guys the early sort of advance notice about that. Any questions about all of that? It is fairly clear. It's clear what we're going to do. It feels hard to me. I'm not ready for changing the definitions, but it seems to be the way the wind is blowing. It is entirely possible that I will be the chest representative to the ultimate official conference, and so I will get to have my say-so on that. What do you guys think of it? Anybody? I know a lot of you have your phones and your microphones muted. I can see that on the little display here. Yeah, in fact, almost every one of you has your microphone muted. So, okay, never mind. We'll perhaps come back later and talk about that. Next thing I want to show you. Oh, there we go. This was me asking you the question. I forgot I had a slide that said, ask everybody, is it a good idea or a bad idea? We'll come back to that later. Okay, the next study I want to tell you a little bit about is the IMPRESS study. And some of you on the line here actually participated and contributed patients to the IMPRESS study. It was in, was it November? Actually, I have it here on a slide. It was back in 2013. We all spent 24 hours gathering information about our patients with severe sepsis that were admitted to our ICUs. So our aims, of course, were we wanted to see were there practice gaps in the care of patients. We wanted it to be worldwide, and you will soon see that it was. And we wanted to evaluate the impact of sepsis, severe sepsis, and septic shock on outcome. So now I'm not allowed to give you, here, methods, prospective, observational, quality improvement project, just to seek the prevalence of the patients that were presenting with either severe sepsis or septic shock, and to find out how many people were complying with evidence-based practices. So from midnight until 2400, every patient presenting either to the ED or being cared for in an ICU with severe sepsis or septic shock was enrolled. Had to be either ED or ICU. There had to be a high clinical suspicion of an infection. They had to have sepsis as defined by the presence of infection with SIRS, and they had to have acute organ dysfunction or shock. So in essence, we were looking for patients with severe sepsis or septic shock. So these are all the countries where people participated. And so pretty much all of North America, very large chunks of South America, most of Europe, Russia, China, India, Australia, in Malaysia and the Oceania area, I believe they call this, and even a few in Africa. So all told, in 24 hours, amongst all these countries, we found 1,794 patients with severe sepsis or septic shock involving 618 sites in 62 different countries. I think that's pretty cool. The overall mortality around the world for those 1,794 patients was 28.4%. So I have to be careful in what I say because there is a paper. Actually, the paper is pretty well written, but it will be submitted to a journal for publication, so I can't give out a lot of data. These data, though, were presented at the Society of Critical Care Medicine meeting last month, and so it's okay for me to let that out. As we said, the overall mortality was 28.4%. In North America, partly thanks to you guys, there were 501 patients detected. In North America, our mortality was 24.1%. Worldwide, full compliance with the 3-hour bundle, and just to remind you, that means lactate measurement, it means blood cultures before antibiotics, it means antibiotics within an hour, and it means fluid bolus of 30 mLs per kilo if the lactate's greater than 4 or hypotension is present. So if you number of places or percent of places that complied with that full 3-hour bundle was 19%. So already we know that, oh, pardon me.
Sorry, do you have wheels?
Yes, Beth is sending a bus for me.
Okay, I should say we're all about relieving. I was just
Yeah.
like, what if you have wheels?
Yes, I'm good. Thanks, Chad. Appreciate it. So I apologize for that, guys, but it was very kind of them to make sure I have a ride to leave the Chest World headquarters and not be stranded overnight. So only 19% complied with the full 3-hour bundle around the world out of those 1,794 patients. And here's what's interesting, though. Amongst those who did have full compliance with the 3-hour bundle, the mortality was about 20%. And amongst those who did not have full compliance, the mortality was about 30%. So I think that's what I can show you, but I hope that's a little bit helpful. I will be sending out an email to all the participants in the IMPRESS trial. So all of you guys that participated will get this email from me that pretty much reiterates what I just said. And I think that's that hopefully that quenches your thirst. I get emails from time to time from people that participated and go, okay, well, so we did all this for you. What are the results? Partly this may be useful for you guys to see. With any kind of clinical study, it takes years before this thing appears in publication somewhere. And there are more details, more interesting things that can be gotten from the data, but that I can't talk about. I went to the main organizing committee and said, guys, what do you think it's okay for me to talk about in public with people? And I have permission to say what I said tonight, and beyond that, I can't say anything, but there will be more with the publication. So there's that. And then, Bob, I'm going to do one more thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. Oops. Well, this will be useful too, but let me find the other one. Okay, those of you who participate in the Kansas Sepsis Project database, you will find shortly this particular thing that I'm showing is a capability that's going to be in the new database when we release it. You won't notice a difference in anything except that you will be able to get better reports. And you'll be able to make a report just like this one for your own hospital if you choose once the database is released. Basically, I asked for 2 or 3 new things in the database, and I will actually show it to you probably next month on the conference call. But in that database, we're going to do 2 things that are important. We have now included screening and diagnosing forms for nursing homes and for emergency medical services. So that we will be asking nursing homes and EMS folks to begin to diagnose and take action on patients with severe sepsis. And of course, they have their screening tool is very similar to the one that you guys fill out now. But their tracking tool, of course, has different things that they need to track, like how rapidly did they transport to the hospital and that sort of thing. One of the things on the reports that you'll be able to do is show me. You can run a report that does one of 2 things. You can say either show me from time 0 when we put our first patients in, show me month by month or year by year, various parameters. Or you'll be able to specify what the date was. If you happen to know what the date was with your initial data entry, you'll be able to say, specify that date and then show me monthly or yearly or quarterly, I think I may have. And so what I chose to plot out here was all the doctors and all the hospitals that are in the database right now. And I asked this question of the database. I said, okay, from the time that each hospital got into the Kansas Sepsis Project, what happened with their accuracy in identifying severe sepsis or septic shock based on the chart review? And so, this is one of the things we've been tracking all along. And I'm kind of excited about this because it gives me the kind of information I need to help the Kansas Sepsis Project be more successful. So what do we see on this graph? We see that from time zero, which starts here, for about the first 6 months, there's pretty good uptake and accuracy and improvement in the accuracy of diagnosis, meaning your doctors in your hospital are recognizing severe sepsis better. And when you do your audits, you're finding that, hey, we are recognizing severe sepsis. The doctors are calling it severe sepsis. And the increase goes for about 6 months. Then it sort of plateaus. And after about month 9, guess what? It drops off. Accuracy in diagnosing drops off. And so what I think is cool about this is I now know that on average, often you are in the Kansas Sepsis Project because I came out to your hospital and asked you to be. And so on average, it looks to me like I need to be sure that I make a trip back to a new hospital somewhere between 6 and 9 months, and perhaps that will help us to keep our recognition at the high levels we want it to be. Again, as soon as this is released, which is actually going to be soon after I make sure that all the bugs are worked out and all the different things we need are present. As soon as this is worked out, you guys will have this kind of capability yourself. So all of a sudden, it's going to be much more powerful for you in your hospital to be able to see what kind of difference your sepsis efforts are making. So, that's the stuff that I had to show you. And I think I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but I know Bob Badgett and Yunus Hussain are on in Wichita, and Bob is Bob, I forgot to find out whether you're associate or full professor at the University of Kansas School of Medicine in Wichita. And Bob and his colleagues, and I presume the colleagues, I should know the list of names, Bob, I'm sorry, but I bet Eunice is one of the ones that worked with you on the meta-analysis. So Bob's been working on a project called Open Meta-Analysis and Living Systematic Reviews, and I think I'll just let him tell you all about it. Bob, I am going to change the presenter to you. If you're ready, are you all set?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. You should get a message now that says that I'm turning the screen over to you. And if you want it, you say yes. And then I'll let you tell us all about what you've been doing and what it has to do with severe sepsis.
Okay, is my screen coming through?
I'm not seeing it yet. Oh, oops. Yeah, it was. I think it's just behind another window. Yes, I've got your screen. Everyone else have Bob's screen?
Yes.
Perfect. That was Belinda. Good.
And interrupt me if my voice is not coming through clearly. So I'm joined in the room with me with Dr. Yunus Hussain, is a second-year resident in internal medicine here, and this topic is actually his inspiration as he's preparing for his grand rounds on this topic in a couple of months. Melissa Gaines not in the room as faculty here who does ICU and clinic attending, myself, and hoping Dr. Simpson will join our crew here. So let me tell you a little bit about the method before we get into the results. So living systematic review was proposed twice in the last year. And we realized that we were kind of doing this already for our grand rounds over the last year. About 1 out of 3 grand rounds, the resident would typically find a recent systematic review, a couple trials afterwards. It seemed easiest just to combine them into one document. And so that's what we've done, and there's URLs where you can see the ones we have in process. One has been published a few months ago. A couple are under review. The EGDT one is done, the manuscript being written now. Now that's what we'll go over. This is great timing for us. Really appreciate the opportunity because this is a really good chance to vet it with clinical expertise. So this living systematic review has some really strong implications. So what makes it different from a regular systematic review is we don't recreate the work each time a topic is reviewed. If the review's already out there, we capitalize on it. And we believe this will commoditize the maintenance and updating of a meta-analysis with these 2 implications. The first one could be quite strong. So all proposed trials at each step when they come under review, they should be accompanied by a meta-analysis. And I think we've all seen instances where unnecessary research has occurred or not optimally designed research has been executed. And maybe this would reduce that. The other part that's fun about this is it lets non-meta-analysts execute this. So advanced trainees, as in Eunice's case, but savvy clinical faculty or just savvy clinicians. I think we've all read meta-analyses, perhaps sometimes even the Cochrane ones. They're very weighty, bulky, they got a lot of stuff in there, but sometimes maybe they didn't quite have the clinical insight that someone in the trenches would have. So now let's get on to our topic. This is the existing meta-analysis on this. It's written by Gu, right there at the bottom, Gu et al. In Critical Care a few months ago. And so that's her forest plot. And it's very nicely done, even brings in Chinese language trials, but the results are a little unsatisfying. So we've highlighted on the right the 2 main trials, since ARISE wasn't published at the time she published the review. And so the 2 main trials contradict, and then the heterogeneity is moderate, according to the Cochrane interpretation of that. Now I've quoted Gu's conclusion, and so the meta-analysis is significant, but yet it doesn't feel very satisfying when we know the last and very large trial was negative. So we saw this as an opportunity. Okay. Now I seem to have rerouted my mouse button. Okay. So the new trials that have come out since, the ARISE trial, which everyone knows, also turns out there's a Zambian trial that's worth briefly noting. It's also EGDT. The patients are unusual in that the majority have HIV, but their monitoring is most unusual using the jugular venous assessment. The trial was stopped early because people who had respiratory distress at the beginning had a tendency of almost significance for increased mortality in the EGDT group who was getting higher fluids. And I think it's a reminder of what happens if you have no central line access, which they didn't. So here is our first crack at the data. This is the early group of Gu's with the ARISE added. So you can see the ARISE added at the last row. And our numbers are pretty much identical. The relative risk is about the same as in hers. The heterogeneity is almost identical as well. Now let's see if we can go farther with this. So we add meta-regression to this. And so this is where you can regress some of the parameters of the trials to see if it gives you some insight. First, we look at year of publication, and there's a significant association and this is not a surprise, the more recent studies are less likely to have significant results. But there's another one that's very interesting, the control group mortality rate. The higher the mortality rate in the control group that didn't get their EGDT, they were more likely to benefit from EGDT. And there's almost statistical significance with these guys correlating with each other, the mortality in the control group. So as time progresses, the more recent publications are having less mortality in the control group. So let's at least briefly play with some ideas why this might be. The first one is the Will Rogers phenomena. So you may recall that's based on his observation that when the Okies moved to California, the intelligence was increased in both states. And that was his explanation for some of the things going on in oncology, that as you improved your ability to diagnose, it made the disease appear milder. And we had limited ability to look for the Will Rogers phenomena. The lactate level at entry to the trial and the year of publication were not correlated, but the data was very sparse. I wonder if Kalkinen's explanation may be what's at play here. So last year found that sepsis mortality is improving over time, but also just better care. All diagnoses in the ICU are improving. So maybe there's this unmeasurable improvement in the systemization of care in the ICU. Now here's where we did multiple variable linear regression. We put both year and control group mortality together, and the one that came out significant was the control group mortality. And so this is the conclusion I would pose, is the variation is more than just a progression of knowledge, but it's also how well each ICU applies that knowledge. If it was just a progression of knowledge, then I believe the year of publication should have been the independent significant variable. And here's what that meta-regression looks like. And so on the left is the low mortality. 0.2 is roughly what happened in a rise in process. And then some of the older studies on the far right had pretty high mortality. And then this is, unfortunately, for mathematical reasons, you have to use this very difficult variable to understand. It's the odds ratio transformed by the natural log. Basically, this light line in the middle is an odds ratio of no benefit, and the lower down, the more benefit. So your benefit is down here in the lower right, high mortality, good odds ratio, a rise in process, nothing. Now this is really fascinating to go back to Dr. Simpson's data from the IMPRESS. So 28% mortality right about here. Just a quick calculation while you were talking, that would make an odds ratio or similar to a relative risk of about 0.7. So it kind of makes you think about implications for units that have that rate of mortality. And we'll look at that in more detail. Here's where we try to meta-regress clinical variables, so the baseline lactate. There's this hint of something going on, but we only had 4 studies reporting that data, so it didn't come out significant. Okay, so now if you accept the idea that mortality rate in the control group is related to the benefit from EGDT, then that would justify subgrouping these trials as we did here. So the 2 groups with low mortality, and these had process and arise had less than 20%, and then groups with high mortality, and I believe those ranged, I think the lowest one was around 40 to 50%, which of course leaves this 28% value you have in the lurch in between. But when you do this, you get these relative risks that I think are much more satisfying now. So the process and arise, of course, show no benefit, whereas the studies with higher mortality rates do show the benefit. And then it's also nice that the heterogeneity is now minimal, 0 and 3%, and there's a significant difference in the subgroups. So that's our data. Now what conclusion can we put up? Well, first of all, does it make horse sense? So I have to disclose that I've been rarely in an intensive care in a decade or more. So what would happen if all of a sudden I'm a full-time doc in intensive care? And I think this, running through this scenario, makes me a believer that these results have force sense and face validity. So if I was put in an ICU, I would pose that I'm going to be a lot slower than all you guys in making my decisions because I just don't have my patterns down. And I would assume that my mortality is going to be higher than 20%. Well, now that I've seen the results worldwide, I'm assuming I'm going to be higher than 28%. And I think I would like to have a central line around with SCVO2 because I would get the continuous feedback from the CVP and the SCVO2. That may not help you because you can make, you're going to have fast pattern recognition, and you might also be willing to wait 30 to 60 minutes for your lactate level. But for me, who's not as experienced, I would like this. And that makes me think this is plausible why hospitals with higher mortality would have the benefit from the central venous oxygenation and pressures.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the conclusion we are posing and would love to get y'all's feedback on. Now, if your mortality rate's less than 20%, and I acknowledge you can quibble on that number, is it 30%? But if your hospital mortality rate's less than 20% without routine central venous catheterization, then you don't need routine central venous catheterization. However, you're still going to insert in maybe half your patients. It's hard to know why, but it looks like it was largely done for pressors in these two recent trials, but maybe in a few times it was for CVP monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
The other conclusion is better standards for reporting of trials. In particular, a clear definition of time zero. Time zero in the ER is pretty easy to determine, but what's time zero in a patient already hospitalized? Mm-hmm. And then reporting the means and standard deviations of some of these process measures of timing of delivery would help us do better regression analyses. Mm-hmm. So I feel like that's a conservative conclusion, that we're not overreaching on our data, but in a little bit I'd love to hear y'all's impression. Okay, do we want to try to go beyond that conclusion? So the conclusion I just said is in gray. Do we want to try to make a statement on the SCVO2 monitoring? I believe the European guidelines are still recommending this, but I'm not sure if we want to try to make a statement on this because we've not formally hit this literature as thoroughly, but there seems to be these two trials with conflicting results. But again, we find the same thing. The benefit seems to be with the sicker patients, perhaps, with the higher lactate level. Mm-hmm. It's kind of hard to make a firm conclusion on what to do, what type of line to put in if you put one in.
Right.
Okay, what about this one? Should we abandon protocols? So these are two copy-pastes from the discussion sessions of the rise in the process. I felt like the process statement here is a bit strong. There's no significant advantage of protocol-based resuscitation. So I haven't been in the ICU in the last 10 years, but I definitely served my time in the early 90s. And, you know, I think there's much systemization that's occurred over these last 2 decades that the process authors may not be respecting. I think if you drop in an ICU now versus 20 years ago, it's much more systematic in the care that's going on, whether or not you say you have a formal protocol. Mm-hmm. And in my view, and maybe people on this phone call have more inside information, it's hard to know what degree of systemization occurred in these 2 trials and their control groups. Here's 2 glimpses. In the process trial, we know that there was systematic capturing of data. But did they hide that data? Was it available to the investigators? To the clinicians? And if so, that's a degree of a process right there, that they're getting these serial, hourly lactate levels. In the ARISE group, there's not much statement about the usual care, but I do know they talk about the team. So does that mean the team designed their local habits? Or does that just mean each team made an individual clinical decision? It's hard to know. But I would pose it's a lot more deliberate than it was a decade ago. Mm-hmm. And of course, everybody knows about the PROMISE study. So let me just take you for a short spin to what we're doing. So here is the EGDT meta-analysis. It's on the web. There's the address. We've not publicized it because we haven't published it yet. I'm trying to get that out of my way. So we do a very short clinical summary. It's highly structured in what's the elements of it. And note that conclusion about do you need catheters depending on your mortality rate, that's not in here. The interpretations we would leave for publication because that gives unique content to the journal, and more importantly, it puts out the more provocative stuff into peer review, which is important. Then our methods are fairly similar from effort to effort, except for the identification of the trials that we do. And then we try to write this to be friendly to the reader. I suppose everyone's been in a 100-page PDF of the Cochrane, and they're kind of challenging. So our PICO table is here. It's interactive, you know. If you want to chase the article, you've got a link to it. We don't mind using a yellow highlight if one of our trials has a very unusual difference that may explain its result. And then I'm hoping it's just a bit easier to navigate than some of the other ways of presenting this. Then we're fairly formal in our methods. We have a risk of bias table as proposed by the Cochrane and the grade. And we use the Cochrane's categories. Again, it's interactive. Color indicates the degree of compliance. And then you say, what is this unclear risk in the Rivers trial? And it'll give you a little bit more information. And we're as structured as we can be on our judgments based on the methods of the Cochrane and the grade. Mm-hmm. We go on down. Now this may be disturbing initially. Everyone's in pink, even process and arise. But, you know, we have to acknowledge that none of these trials are blinded. Now, whether or not that influences the conduct and outcome, you know, that's hard to say. You have a reluctant EGDT enthusiast in the control group or vice versa. Does that make a difference? Mm-hmm. Then again, following the methods of the Cochrane, based on the number of subjects and unclear risk or high risk, a summary judgment is made. In this case, unclear because all the studies came from unclear. Go back to the summary. Here's our meta-regression. And then here's our summary of findings table as done by the grade currently. Everything I just showed you for the quality of the studies is one element of this grade here. And then we end up with the absolute effect. Then here, if the hospitals with high mortality, 1 in 57 people would benefit. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. 15 out of 100 benefit. Mm-hmm. Which, if I was a patient, they put a line in me. But in a hospital with low mortality, you know, the benefit's not measurable. Mm-hmm. And then we've got a nice relationship worked out with Wikidoc, which is sort of a Wikipedia equivalent that's maintained at Harvard. We've not put our entry in there yet, but we will when we're further along. We're very transparent, so if someone later wants to modify this, you know, we can start with making issues and comments. And so here you can track. Here's the discussion we've been having over the last couple of days about the Zambian trial. Should we keep it or not? Mm-hmm. Or how should it handle it? Mm-hmm. At any rate, so I think that's what we have. So if people have comments on our methods or on our conclusions, if people are interested in our methods and would like to submit one of their ideas and do an open meta-analysis, that would be great. So leave the microphone on, but I'll stop talking.
Cool. So Bob, I have a couple of questions then. So you built on GU's data by adding a new study, by adding the ARISE study to it. but it seems like you probably had to extract all that data out of the same studies that GU used. Is that right? So like, or did GU provide enough in the appendices and so forth that you could actually pull the numbers you needed?
We've done at least a half a dozen of these. And getting the numbers is always very easy. The trickier part is getting the risk of bias assessment. And there's been occasional times where we disagree with their assessment, perhaps because there was wobble in their judgment, or maybe they used a different criteria. But in summary, the numbers are easy. The judgments on bias are hard.
Okay, that's good. So honestly, oh, let me see. I had another question before I move on. Let me see. So numbers are easy. You build on that, and so the concept of open meta-analysis or uh, a living systematic review would be, so say when the promise data come out from Europe, you would be able to just plug those data right into what you've got here now, and that's your intent, I presume.
Yes, that would be our intent. Now, then it raises all kinds of questions. Does another publication happen at that time? And so we have a methods paper that's out for review at this time, where probably in clinical medicine, we're going to have to address the same issues that the molecular people are addressing when they use these terms called microattribution and nanopublication. So in their field, they may define one individual's one individual's contribution in the molecular area that, and track it over time. And we may end up having to do something like that. So when Promise comes out, I suppose my hope is someone with a lot more clinical experience in this field than me would want to take that publication. And then maybe the public part of it would just simply replace what we've done at our URL, but then whoever is driving that revision would then submit under their name for publication to a journal, and a journal who is friendly to this type of methodology.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know something, looking at this, I'm not pessimistic about CHEST for taking something like this, if you want to know the truth, for a couple of reasons. One is that Richard Irwin is very open-minded about different methodologies, especially when they are rigorous this way. I think if you were to include in an article everything you just put in this presentation, I think that it would make a dynamite article that I would want to read as a sepsis researcher. And I think it would be a full-size research article. I'm not sure, if I were you, that I'd try and limit it to a I forget what terms we were using, but a smaller research communication. I think it could be a full-size research article because it has the oomph to it, I think, for it to be. So the methods paper you have out now is going to describe the living systematic reviews and the open meta-analysis concept and so forth, or that's what it does.
And then there is an alternative method. Joseph Lau has funding from AHRQ for the blanking on the name of it, the SRDR database. And that's on the web at AHRQ. It's much larger than ours, but I like ours a lot better.
Yeah.
And so the methods paper will talk about the two alternatives, the pros and cons, the implications, which I think are really quite strong about requiring meta-analyses whenever protocols are reviewed.
Yeah. I think that's a pretty cool That's a nifty idea. So instead of, yeah, and as you are probably aware, um, when I get a new, say, drug company protocol, as I will be here shortly, I signed the confidentiality agreement, so shortly I'll be seeing what this drug is about. It makes very good sense to include a meta-analysis of what the data is instead of just what they have traditionally done is just a review article basically of what's known instead of some sort of rigorous analysis of what's known. Um, I think that's a neat idea. I think that's really cool. Um,
So as far as what kind of paper we do, that would probably be in Eunice's court, who's here with me, because he's the one putting the time on to publishing this. But so he's actually been in the trench on doing this, and I'm going to ask him if he has any comment on how much work this is. Would he? And I think an important comment to think about is if someone who didn't develop this process was not with him, would he be able to do this?
right.
Does it require someone closely helping?
Right.
Definitely, it's something very interesting what Dr. Badgett gave me the opportunity to work on. But like he was talking earlier, at least from my standpoint, which is a resident level knowledge with statistics and stuff like that, a lot of the meta-regression and the details to get to the plots and all the final pictures, really Dr. Badgett did most of the work. I'm putting my clinical input more than the statistical input. So for our level that are resident, I think we need someone with this level of sophistication to pull those data out to help us kind of shape it. I don't think resident can do something like that by themselves, because there's a lot of details in those numbers.
Mm-hmm. That kind of makes sense. That kind of makes sense. Well, and probably Eunice, how many of these have you done now or participated in?
That's my first one, to be honest.
Okay, good. Okay. So you'll be able to tell us later on, maybe in a couple of years, you'll tell us whether even still as a resident or with less experience as a younger attending physician, whether it becomes easier as you do.
Definitely.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that all makes sense to me. So just to recap for everybody else, I think so. Bob and Eunice and I are talking about some details about meta-analysis, but the key thing is, I think the most fascinating thing about this is the meta-regression that shows that the sicker you are and the more likely the control is to die, the more effective is early goal-directed therapy. Looks like Bob may be scrolling to that right now. Yeah. So when you see over on the left, when you're not that sick, your Apache scores are low and your predicted mortality is low, then it's not necessarily useful. But when your predicted mortality is high, it may be. So, Bob, I didn't tell you about the IMPRESS data. We do know that the mortality is substantially higher in shock patients around the world than it is in non-shock patients. So remember, IMPRESS was both severe sepsis and septic shock. So it may very well be that early goal-directed therapy, and in fact, actually, I didn't show this, but it will be in the IMPRESS paper too, that there actually worldwide there was more there was an even tighter correlation of survival with the 6-hour bundle, which is similar to early goal-directed therapy, although not 100% identical. So that IMPRESS data sort of reinforced this.
No, I don't. You're talking about the Apache. I've not seen the Apache data for a rise in process. So it's not clear to me if their mortality was low because their patients were less sick, or they're just so good that even in their control group they do well.
Right. There's potentially a little bit of both. If you don't mind, I'm going to take back the screen here for a second and look at a study that I show my screen. Okay, let me see if I can find this. Chest 2014. Sepsis literature update. So I did a year in review of sepsis, and here. So if we do this, so the Apache data is in the appendices of both of those studies, the online data appendix. So here first is the Manny Rivers study. The Apache 2s there for standard therapy and early goal-directed therapy were 20 and 21. That's similar in the process trial, 20 and 20. But in the ARISE trial, the Apache score was substantially lower at the outset, at the time of randomization. And so there's a little bit of that. And so the patients were less sick at the time of randomization. But the process trial, the patients were not demonstrably less sick by Apache score, but their expected mortality was lower, or their control mortality was lower. So I think that's a part of what you said, that perhaps overall care has improved. Very interesting. That's very, very interesting. So there's data that kind of supports both of your contentions there. And again, these data are all available. The Apache stuff, no, I think Apache must be hidden in tables. You can see it's table 1 and table 1 of both process and ARISE, and then table 2 of the Manny Rivers trial.
Perfect. I missed it. And I noticed in process and ARISE, I hope I didn't miss on this, but the lactate levels are backwards from the Apaches.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And isn't that interesting? And what will that mean? I don't know. You'll have to do more of the ongoing meta-analysis to figure that out. And we'll see what PROMISE adds to this. That'll be very fascinating to see what PROMISE trial, which is out, I think maybe sometime in the spring here. See if that adds enough lactate information for you to make anything. My guess would be still not yet, because you don't have that many studies where it's reported. Well, this is outstanding. And Bob, I want to talk to you and Eunice more about how I can contribute to this and help you out. But I would encourage you to go for a full research report somewhere, because I think you've got the data and the arguments that would make it go well, and I think that CHEST would be amenable to this. I do understand a lot of the same studies were looked at by GU, but GU did not do that meta-regression and did not do that additional stuff that you did, that I think makes it a worthwhile entry into the sepsis literature. Well, guys, we have managed to use an hour. It is 7:01, and I hope you guys found that as cool and as informative as I did. And I think when we get some more of the IMPRESS information, and I'm able to share with you about the shock mortality from IMPRESS, it will make sense why more hospitals need to be using the 6-hour bundle or early goal-directed therapy than are not, at least for the time being. Because it looks like worldwide septic shock mortalities are substantially in excess of 30%. Let me see. Oh, what I'm doing here is pulling up a calendar because, as you know, I always forget what day the next meeting is going to be until I pull it up. So we always meet, Bob, just for your information, because I know you're new to this, we always do meet on the second Thursday of the month. On the 12th of March is when we will meet, and it will be a noon meeting. We alternate back and forth, so we're at noon one month and at 6 p.m. the next month, so that way people who have conflicts at one time or another can be present for one or another of those meetings. So guys, our next meeting will be Thursday, March 12th at noon. We will talk some more about the Kansas Sepsis Project database. I know for sure that much we will talk about, and then whatever else comes up between now and then during the month, we will get on board. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Bob, thanks very much. I'll contact you soon so we can talk. Maybe worth a trip to Wichita so we can sit down and talk face to face.
Well, and I may have other reasons to be coming up to Kansas City as well, so either place or both.
Cool. Sounds good to me.